Now, by the way, and this is an important point to keep in mind, is that the first three conditions, that the chain is unbroken, that every narrator is adil, and every narrator is dhabit, and these three conditions are not that difficult, at least for muhaddithin, let's say, not for us. These three conditions are not that difficult to determine, but the last two are very difficult. Now, some writers on hadith, some scholars of hadith, they do not necessarily have the time or the ability to check the last two conditions. So they will study just the first three conditions. And when they study the first three conditions and they see that these conditions are met, they'll say that the Isnad is Sahih. They'll say that the Isnad is Sahih. Now there's a big difference between saying the Isnad is Sahih and between saying the Hadith is Sahih. Okay, and unfortunately when people nowadays, when many writers, especially in the Arabic literature, because English literature we haven't reached this point yet, especially in the Arabic literature, sometimes people go to some of the scholars of hadith and they say that this hadith, the scholar said the Isnad is Sahih, and they understand that to mean that the hadith is Sahih. This is not correct. It is not, one does not necessarily imply, or the first one does not necessarily imply the second one. If a scholar only had the ability or the time or whatever to check the first three, then he will say that the Isnad is Sahih. But that does not mean that the hadith is Sahih until you check and make sure that none of the last two conditions have been violated. So you must distinguish between a scholar of hadith saying that the Isnad is Sahih and between him saying that the hadith is Sahih. Now there's some exceptions that some scholars give for some of the great scholars of hadith. Let's say, for example, historically, like Ibn Hajar. If Ibn Hajar says that the Isnad is Sahih, people take it for granted that he means also that the hadith is Sahih. But I don't know if you can always say that's the case. You have to be careful about that. Okay. So for those of you especially who have access to some of the Arabic literature on hadith and so forth, you have to keep in mind this distinction if a scholar of hadith says the Isnad is Sahih and when he says the hadith is Sahih. One, from the first one you cannot automatically assume or conclude the second one.